Hello, everyone, and welcome to Education in Focus, powered by Chalkboard News. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, which publishes chalkboardnews.com. Chalkboard is a news website dedicated to issues related to K-12 education. Joining me again today is Brendan Clary, Chalkboard's K-12 editor. We are recording this on Monday, July 24th. Brendan, how to properly discipline misbehaving children has been debated for as long as I can remember, both at home and in school. For the purposes of Education in Focus, we of course will focus on discipline in schools here. Brendan, our listeners might not be aware of this, but you're a few years younger than me, just a few years. Growing up, I went to Catholic school back in the day, and you might have heard through legend or whatever these tales of Catholic school nuns with rulers rocking around smacking students' knuckles for misbehavior. That indeed was a thing. I felt their wrath on more than one occasion. But that kind of corporal punishment is frowned upon today, and rightly so, I'd say. But how to properly discipline students who disrupt entire classrooms remains an important topic of discussion. Brendan, you wrote about this topic at chalkboardnews.com from the standpoint of a new polling that came out. Tell us what did respondents to the poll have to say?
Yes. So, well, first off, on your point about corporal punishment, there was an interesting sort of letter, like a Dear Colleague letter sent out by the Department of Education earlier this year, and they were addressing that, saying, don't do this anymore. So I think that you're right that that has come up. And there are a number of states that actually still allow for that, but I don't know if, they just don't have anything on the books, but a lot of states do actually say you can't corporally punish students anymore. So that I think for most people will be, a thing of the past. But so with the recent polling, it was by a parental organization, like a parental rights organization, Parents Defending Education, and they commissioned it. And they basically asked 1,600 registered voters. So not necessarily, parents, but just registered voters. And they asked them about their schools. And so 52% of voters said that their schools are good at enforcing school discipline, and 40% said they were poor. And, so there was like some people who didn't, answer, refused to answer, we're not sure. But, that's 40% of the respondents there saying that their school's not doing a good job at enforcing the school discipline policies. So that's, I think some people have pointed out in recent months, and I've written about this before, that there's sort of this tension between maybe policies that are very restorative justice focused on how do we get students to think about what they've done and to create an environment where, there's a lot of built-in learning about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable versus, sort of these hardline disciplines of like, if you break the rules, then you will get a, XYZ punishment, in school suspension, out of school suspension, or, massive detention. And so I think that there's a number of people who are saying, we're not enforcing the policies that are in place, and students are able to kind of get away with what they want to get away with, essentially. And so that the learning environment is not, conducive to the goal of education of learning the material, taking the tests. And so that's something that I wrote about when I was talking with experts in restorative justice, that there are concerns about this.
Briefly explain restorative justice and what the concept is.
Yeah, sure. So it started actually in the criminal justice, like juvenile justice sector, and it was moved over to schools. And I think that actually began in Australia from the experts that I talked to, who gave me a rundown of the background about this. And so in the last 10 years or so, it's been a sort of a term used to describe a culture in public schools, mainstream public schools, even over the last 10 years, has kind of been adopted to become like a term for it. Let's talk about, boundaries in the classroom. And then when you stray outside of those, it's sort of a focus on communication and making sure that students have an opportunity to make things right when they've, sort of transgressed against the school environment. So it's sort of this kind of bigger encompassing word that works alongside of some of these like social emotional learning things. Like there'll be like a restorative justice circle that students can talk about, their backgrounds and what's going on this week. And then that kind of also plays into like how discipline actually is meted out. So like if you break the rules, then you'll have a restorative conference with everybody that was, like in the fight in the hallway sort of thing. So they'll have the parents of everybody who was involved, and you'll be talking about how this hurt you, and they'll try to facilitate a discussion. And so the people I talked to, they said that isn't always in lieu of justice, of like, you're getting expelled. critics of it say that it can sometimes slow that process down. And maybe if it's not implemented properly, students are not getting, the sort of punishment that they need to be getting or that they sort of deserve because of, these sort of barriers to being suspended. You know what I mean? And so there is some, I believe it's the Nevada Educators Association. They recently were opposed to legislation that they were in favor of. They basically made a stand and said, hey, we're not in favor of this restorative justice law that requires restorative practices before discipline is being meted out, because it basically creates an environment where we can't have control over the classroom environment. So there's been some pushback from teachers and also from critics in some recent pieces that have been published. I think there was one by the Manhattan Institute where an educator basically said, hey, this is something that, these restorative practices are keeping educators from maintaining control in the classroom. So that's kind of the backdrop of this, I think. And the education department has also made it clear that they're interested in ensuring that discipline is, not racially discriminatory. And I think that that's something that everybody's focused on as well, is how do you make sure that your punishments are being enforced equally? And I think that restorative justice sees that as a way to combat that, of these racial sort of disproportionately against students of color sort of thing. So, and that's something that I think is good. Everybody wants that, but it's hard to sort of implement these policies, it seems like.
The mission of all schools is to educate the children who are brought before them. And when you have so much disruption in class that it affects either the entire class or a significant portion of the class, something needs to be done by educators, principals, teachers, etc. in the school to end that disruption as quickly as possible so you can get back to learning. Doesn't sound like, again, I was referencing the corporal punishment and the nuns smacking the knuckles. That was 40, 50 plus years ago. It looks like 40, 50 years on, we're still trying to figure out how to best end the disruptions of disorderly students so you can get back to the best learning environment available.
The complicating factor there is, I think, the critics of some of these policies that are pretty hardline, or maybe saying if you do this, then this will happen, are saying that they bring up what's called the school to prison pipeline, which is, I think, sort of often used by these advocates for restorative justice, for sort of these practices, these discipline policies that are like restorative justice, and they're basically saying that if you have students who are being sent out of school, they get further behind, and then they're also ending up in prison even sooner. So that was an interesting finding from the recent poll that was from last week, is that 31% of voters said school discipline makes it more likely that students would end up in the criminal justice system, but 37% responded that it doesn't really have an effect. So there's sort of this opinion that doesn't really have, if you're disciplined by the school, for what you've done in school, that doesn't necessarily tie into. So that's, again, this is the public's opinion, sort of. This isn't hard data. This isn't hard findings, but it's just interesting that that's kind of the polls of 1,600 registered voters that this is what they found, right? And that they also said 73% of respondents said school administrators should not factor in a student's race when deciding how to discipline after an offense. And, that comes after on the heels of the affirmative action ruling by the Supreme Court. So that's just another consideration of, if you break the rules, then should you be disciplined no matter what your race is? And it seems like most of the respondents said that, a student's race should not factor into that. So it's...
Yeah, and that seems like a no-brainer, right? Just like everything in society and schools, etc., there should be no racial factors. Everything should be equitable with how we treat people. I know that's not necessarily reality in some cases, but among any reasonable adult, racial equity has to be a part of it. This is a topic that we are not going to solve in one episode of Education in Focus. I appreciate your insight into this. Listeners can keep up with these types of stories at chalkboardnews.com. For Brendan Clary, I'm Dan McCaleb. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe.